back to MFA Riders. I hope you all enjoyed your spring breaks and are getting outside and enjoying the improving weather. The pod team is currently recuperating from a long week in LA for the annual AWP conference. We had a lot of fun going to panels, buying books, and getting to chat with past guests and current listeners. But now we need to catch up on some sleep. So we've got a re-release today of a wonderful episode from Season 2. We'll be back next time with an all-new conversation. Until then, you can find MFA Riders on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfariders.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms, or an email at mfariderspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfariders.com. On that same website, you can also click the support button to support us financially, if it's within your means. Or you can do so by going directly to buymeacoffee.com/MFAWriters. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Siloh Radovsky. Siloh is a recent graduate of the cross-genre MFA program at UC San Diego and is currently at work on a collection of linked essays. Her essays, articles, and stories have appeared or are forthcoming in Entropy, Pank, Sunday Theory, Teen Vogue, Inkwell, Alchemy, and Identity Theory. Siloh is also an educator, a collaborator in a narrative medicine intervention with adolescent and young adult cancer patients, and was a founding editor of Kaleidoscoped magazine. She was an artist in residence at the Hinge Arts program in spring 2017, and was the recipient of an Evergreen Foundation activity grant and a summer graduate teaching fellowship at UC San Diego. Today she's brought an excerpt of an essay to read for us.
My brother Jonah looks mystical when he's smoking cigarettes, like he's communing with the dead. He gazes up at the sky when he takes a drag, and down at the pavement when he exhales. Before he was homeless, but after his first batch of psychiatric hospitalizations, Jonah was already smoking like there was a flood inside his lungs that needed drying out. He smelled like cigarettes, his skin looked like ash, and he stared with suspicious deer eyes at our parents like they were speaking to him between lines of silence. He placed the same fixed gaze on me when I got the chance to see him, which wasn't often. He still lived in Minnesota, and I'd abandoned him for the West Coast. The last time he visited me in Olympia, he was 20 years old. Spindly fingers stained ancient orange from cigarettes he rolled out of pipe tobacco, the cheapest, driest option for smoking. I was almost 25 and about to graduate from college. From my kitchen window, I watched him smoke on the worn-out beige couch my housemate Ariel and I recently ditched on the curb. Our next-door neighbor, this guy we nicknamed Potatoes, joined Jonah on the couch. Potatoes' khaki shorts grazed just below his knees, no shirt, slinky ponytail dangling down from a backwards baseball cap. Potatoes looked like Olympia's local Kid Rock. Jonah looked like a kid brother all grown up, a bit frayed and side-eyed. Potatoes said, "Hey brother, mind if I join you?" Jonah didn't mind. He rubbed his hand across his forehead, while Potatoes gestured wildly with camaraderie and inebriated wisdom. Potatoes dropped his hands, resting against the couch, open-bellied and relaxed. I whispered to Ariel across the living room, "Oh my God, do you see this? Jonah's talking to Potatoes." They were having some kind of heart-to-heart. Potatoes lived with this guy we called Meat, a contractor who grew corn in their backyard and parked a classic car in the driveway. "They're good guys, they just like to drink," our landlord reassured us, or maybe warned us when we signed our lease. It's true they liked to drink. Their gatherings with their ruddy-faced neighbors a few houses down often overflowed into a dull, sloppy din. In truth, potatoes looked more like meat than meat did. Potatoes looked like beef jerky, an impossibly lithe and leathery lizard human with a ponytail. His skin was bronzed from his daily shirtless practice of mowing the dry yellow lawn and basking in the sunlight. He was maybe in his early 50s, but could have been in his 40s or 60s for all I knew, as if simultaneously preserved and aged by sunlight and alcohol. His habitual lawn mowing seemed sad and unnecessary, but potatoes appeared perfectly comfortable with his lifestyle. In the mornings, he'd return from the corner store with a 12-pack of Natty Ice, pressing heavy through a plastic bag. He'd lap the small rectangle of their dead lawn with a mower, then perch atop it in a collapsible lawn chair, draining beer can after beer can. I worried my own self-discipline was just as arbitrary as the way potatoes divided his time into chores and leisure. Leisure frightened me, and so did potatoes' relaxation. Was that repose some kind of enlightenment, or was it just giving up? Watching potatoes and Jonah sit on the couch, I thought if Jonah could just hold it together in the most basic way, his art could provide an escape hatch from the bind he was in, this binary between the unchaperoned forest of delusion he skirted and the paternalistic psychiatric treatment he hated. I also knew which side he would err on. I imagined a narrator peeling off of me like a ghost or an angel who levitated in the warm breeze and deflected danger. Yes, soon the boy will sink close to death, but it's merely the valley before his inevitable ascent. The angel captions the scene. It's the beginning of a novel that will be like dialysis, filtering experience in real time before it damages my organs. Fiction that freezes reality before the bad thing happens. Fiction where it is safe to admit to danger because suffering has a denouement and it is grand, full of bright, flashy lights and stable living situations. Street life will smack him, but he gets out quick.
Siloh, thanks for reading that. That was such a good reading. It was so nice to hear you read it, and I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Jared. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, before pursuing writing or higher education, you spent several years involved in what you called anarchist activism and restless train writing. So I have to hear about this. So maybe you could tell us a bit about that time in your life and the ways that you see it influencing the person you are today as a writer, a student, and a teacher.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. Yeah, I mean, that time in my life was so central to both like my journey like to away and then back to creative writing. I came of age in the Twin Cities in like first punk and then like anarchist activist subculture. And when I was 16, there was an announcement that the 2008 Republican National Convention was going to be held in St. Paul, my hometown. And that sort of like cued this like deeper involvement in a particular kind of like anarchist organizing. There was this group called the RNC Welcoming Committee that was like, you know, the anarchist welcoming committee to the political convention. And it was sort of like the last like failed gasp of what I've heard people call the summit model of protest, where like a lot of people who were involved in that group, I mean, it was like a small group, but like several people who were involved in that group had come of age themselves in the late 90s anti-globalization movement, which had these like sort of supposedly like they're very successful at sort of what they had intended to do in terms of shutting down certain political like spectacles or events. And I think that several years later, after their own disillusionment, there was this sudden enthusiasm that we were like going to be able to replicate that, which like did not happen. And like the event itself was like a kind of a political catastrophe in terms of like some legal issues. And we found out, I was like 18 at the time that this happened, that it was revealed that that group that I'd been a part of had been infiltrated by both the FBI and the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department. So like it was just like a total wake up call. I mean, ironically, my participation in that group was like very motivated by this disillusionment with the state. And yet like it was still shocking to experience and witness state violence and sort of the capacity of the state to tamp down on certain kinds of activities, but also really disillusionment with sort of what perhaps we had intended to do. And so that coincided with my graduation from high school. And so I spent the following several years sort of very driftless and a lot of traveling. I rode trains a lot. I hitchhiked a lot. And there were like really amazing experiences that I had through that, and some frankly like quite comical ones. And but also it was just very undercut with like these questions about what it meant to try to participate ethically in the world in the absence of a certain kind of like framework or optimism for doing so. And those questions are definitely still in operation in my work now. And I think that like prior to the sort of political catastrophe of the RNC, I had been like pretty like engaged in my creativity. And I think that I sort of lost that in the wake of those experiences, and then found them again almost against my will when I did end up going to college at Evergreen.
Well, in your work, I mean, I think the political is clearly there, but also the personal. Like this essay you read for us today deals with your brother's schizophrenia, homelessness, and addiction. That essay is part of a collection of linked essays that explore your experience with family, mental illness, and addiction. So tell us about that project a little bit, and what made you choose this forum for exploring these issues.
The project that I read from and that you just described is called Home Remedies, which is a work of nonfiction that's both like narratively and critically exploring my, I guess, like second coming of age, my like post-anarchist subculture coming of age, my mid-20s, and some health issues that I was having at that time, and was trying to figure out what was going on alongside events that were happening in both my family and the broader world, specifically my brother's mental illness and his homelessness, and the 2016 election and sort of the like political nihilism that maybe like sort of catalyzed that, and then also the despair that followed that. And so those moments and those events, I think, really like cast some of my younger self's convictions and lifestyle practices into sometimes like quite unflattering relief, and like kind of like this uncanny echo between them, while also highlighting like in a way the relevance of some of those beliefs, and definitely the desire to feel that sense of possibility and commitment to like engaging in the world in that active way, which I like did not at all feel that in that time period. I felt like very, very full of despair myself. And so like those experiences for me really contain a lot of questions about trying to get better in a world that inflicts so much damage, and also what trying to get better has to do with wanting the world to be different or feeling that that's possible, or just kind of having like really in a way like some kind of spiritual connection to the world, like what those things have to do with each other, but also like more literally illness and treatment and how we talk about those things, and especially mental illness. So the title is like cheeky and it's like the double meaning, because I literally am talking about health subcultures and different ways of understanding the body and sort of taking responsibility for its care, like outside of institutions, for better and for worse, by choice and maybe not by choice, and also like having to interface with medical institutions, but then also like coming of age and finding a place in the world, and how that played out so differently for my brother and for myself, even though in a lot of ways like the choices that we made were pretty similar in our stubbornness and sort of the beliefs that drove those choices. And like that's not to conflate the challenges that he experienced with the ones that I did by any means. But I do feel very strongly that his situation sort of like illustrates the full reality of that shared circumstance, and like living in a world where the cost of living is so tremendously high, and also where care like isn't structured for, which definitely does not impact everyone equally, but it does affect all of us. Yeah, so that's sort of the big nutshell, the project in a big nutshell, and then. Yeah, and then the choice of how to write about those things, that has been a long process that has been full of a lot of like kind of a trial and error, I suppose. But as you mentioned, it's definitely a piece of personal writing. And that was the thing that I really struggled to actually let myself do, I think, because the thematic questions are maybe like my entry point into the project, or maybe the thing that made me feel like entitled to write or aspire to write some kind of like literature about it. But ultimately, like in order to do the kinds of thinking that I wanted to do while also letting feeling into that, it had to become more personal than was easy or kind of comfortable to write.
And you referred to it as nonfiction, and it is nonfiction, but there are parts of it in which you imagine different ways for your brother's life to play out. I've read other parts of this essay, and at one point you referred to it as a chapter of possible or impossible endings. That in and of itself sounds like fiction, right? It sounds like you're making things up. So where do you draw the line between fiction and nonfiction in your writing?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that I've thought about a lot. And it has been a part of the sort of trial and error of figuring the project out. And this seems definitely show, in particular in that essay, where the desire to write fiction shows up, and the failed attempt at doing so is very present. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot I could probably say about like the trajectory towards embracing nonfiction, but just in terms of drawing the line between fiction and nonfiction, I think that one thing that sort of freed me up to allow myself to write nonfiction is realizing that there actually could be space to use these techniques and these devices from fiction to sort of compress something that might otherwise take a lot of space to write, but also just how much speculation has to do with engaging with reality, or especially desiring things to be different. And so I think that there can definitely be space for speculation inside nonfiction. Yeah, but it's really important to me that this project is perceived and sort of framed as nonfiction, because the uncanny reality and those similarities between these different experiences made me want to write fiction initially, just because it seems so bizarre. But actually, I think that bizarreness of real life is part of what is so striking to me about these experiences, and also the fact that bizarreness is not is also a product of these very sort of real historical conditions. And so wanting to make that very legible and clear.
Well, having come from that anti-authoritarian background, you told me you didn't want to write what was expected of you or do things the easy way, but you wanted to write things that made sense to people, even if they were super weird and surprising. So how do you foster exploration in your creative process while still writing something that's accessible to the average reader?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think that like I've been very humbled by the process of learning how to do this kind of writing, and that like that urge to not do things the easy way or to kind of like approach things on my own terms. I don't really have a way around it because I just think it's so much the way that I'm like wired. But the humbling came in just sort of the real consequences of writing things that aren't legible, and sort of like the ways that I was going to have to learn certain literary techniques in order to make that work more legible or sort of aspire to do that. Which I guess is to say that like I've been engaging more with conventional literary techniques, but sort of on my own terms or like on my own timeline in a way where it's more piecemeal of like, I want to do this one specific thing. Like, how do people do that? And I guess like that's like the experimentation is it's not how do I make work that's the most innovative for its own sake, but like what does this particular project or this particular set of questions like sort of need in order for me to be satisfied or in order to sort of do justice to the material. And so that is not something that is necessarily like preset. I mean, I'm sure even writers who don't identify at all with experimental approaches feel similarly. But yeah, I think that's it for me, is that like, there's no like one specific genre that has clearly presented itself to me as like the way to do this. And so it's been a lot of like kind of technique collage, I think. And then, yeah, that has sort of moved me in a certain direction, but it's been a sort of meandering path.
Well, you mentioned that you're kind of embracing conventional storytelling methods a little bit more these days. I'm curious if that's something that comes in the revision process or during the writing process. I guess I'm mostly just curious what your revision process looks like, and if you're thinking about how you could make something slightly more conventional so that it's more accessible, or what exactly you're thinking about as you work through revising a piece.
That's such a good question. I feel like it's so visceral for me, where it's like, I mean, and you've, I'm sure, experienced this too, like in workshop where it's like you bring in a piece or have brought in pieces that it's like certain parts really like pop and like kind of come alive. And then other parts, maybe people or other pieces like you bring in and it just like doesn't quite have that like traction for somebody. And so I think over time of getting feedback or kind of having that reaction, I have learned that like gotten a little bit more aware of the tendencies in my own work that sort of contribute to that. And so revision is so like structural or like architectural for me. And I'm like, what is my revision process at? There's so many, I don't know, like it's just, there's so many parts to it. But in terms of that, like the storytelling, I think that does come through in thinking about like the framework of a piece, or like what the shape of a piece is, and how I want it to be experienced, but also just like what, probably more so than that actually, is just like what provides the space that I'm looking for, where it's like I viscerally know that if I'm just asking these questions in the sort of abstract, it's not hitting on what I really want to do. And so I think the storytelling is both like trying to understand what the work is. And specifically for this project, it's like, whoa, I have all of these questions. How do they fit together? Like, oh my God, like it actually is like narrative. Like it actually does have to do with experience, and like that can be the vehicle for the questioning.
Well, that was a great answer to a really impossible question because, because I find that so much of well, really the writing process in general, but so much of revision for me is just feel, right? Like I'm just reading the sentences and just going on intuition and making changes based on my intuition. And so to try to like describe that is really difficult. But that's interesting, you know, and I do have those same sort of epiphanies when I'm revising a story where suddenly I see the connection between these different parts and realize how that needs to be structured or what needs to change.
Yeah, and I think it's also like realizing that language can do a lot, just do so much. Like, so it's like the sentence level stuff. Like for me, it's like a lot of the feedback that I've gotten and something that I already knew about myself, but like, this is pretty abstract, you know, like what do you, you know, it's like, how do I connect with this? And so the thinking can become embodied through the way that language is used. And that has to do with scene and like sort of staging a story. But I think it also has to do with like that feeling of like the language being tactile and alive. So that's definitely a part of that process too of it's conventional storytelling, but then it's also just really trying to tap into the sentence and like also to just sort of like, as you're saying, like sort of turn on the reader's perspective a little bit, or like try to consider when a piece has shifted from a conversation I'm having with myself to like something that somebody else has an entry point into and is relevant.
Right. Well, before pursuing the MFA, you described your writing as very genre ambiguous, something between poetry, autofiction, and nonfiction. And we've already talked about your kind of anarchist background. So I'm curious if you were concerned at all about the formal academic setting of the MFA and whether or not it would be welcoming to that kind of out-of-the-box style.
I wasn't concerned so much for the program because UC San Diego is so welcoming of ambiguity of all kind and sort of like cross genre work. I felt anxious myself about where was I headed and how would I sort of pull these different things that I was thinking about together or find my style.
In general terms, like what did you hope to get out of the MFA experience? Like what was your motivation for pursuing this?
I have this very vivid memory of, I don't know why I was sitting in this place, but I was like sitting between the bed and the closet of this tiny bedroom that I shared with my partner on my laptop, like researching programs, just kind of like for kicks, and realizing that you could get paid to go to grad school. And it was like a cartoon, like, wowza, like jump, like, oh my God, you got paid to do this? Like springing into action. And it was like, early fall. So it was like a little late in the season to like really be figuring that out. But nonetheless, I proceeded. And that's not to say that it was simply motivated by the money, because as we all know, the money's itself not that good. It's like, but I was working, I had gotten this artist residency while I was working as a barista a year, or maybe it was 2 years after I graduated from Evergreen. And at that time, I was so afraid of not doing anything with my aspirations. And it was sort of this like false sense of urgency that I think a lot of people experience in their 20s, where it's like, after I hit 30, like it's all downhill, it's like this completely unrealistic sense of time about like, the thing that will be cool about me as a writer is that I'm young. And then like, I'm not that young anymore. Like, like maybe I can just get in under the wire or something. And so I had gotten this residency, and that was like really the first thing that had happened since I was in college that affirmed my existence as an artist. And so following that, I had to quit my barista job in order to take the residency, and then had just been working this kind of like there was only 2 beads on the string, but a string of like kind of some weird jobs. And so those jobs, and then also I was training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and had like actually kind of a lot of responsibilities at my academy, because I was like coaching and teaching. And so between work and that, and also my own training, I had so little time. And I had remembered something that a teacher had said at the time that I graduated, when like I was like, yeah, maybe someday I'll go to grad school in that way that like people in my generation are like, yeah, maybe someday I'll like own a house, but it's like both a plan and like completely impossible unless something like drastic in your life changes. And so, grad school was like that. And then this thing my teacher had said that was like, yes, well, you're working this job. Consider the possibility that someday you will want more time to focus on your work, your creative work. And so that was like kind of in the back of my mind. And perhaps what spawned me to do this little like late summer, early fall research into programs. So yeah, I mean, basically it was just like I felt very confused about my work and desiring some kind of structure that would help me sort of navigate these questions and the particular project that I was working on, which is the one that we had just discussed. And then also just the constraints of my life, like didn't really permit the kinds of engagement with the work that I wanted. And I had this really idealistic sense that I could be like somebody who worked like a wage job and then also had like a robust creative practice. And I'm sure that is possible for some people. And it just wasn't happening for me. And so that was what motivated me to pursue an MFA.
Well, the MFA at the University of California, San Diego is a 2-year fully funded program with an optional third year. And the program sounds sort of made for you. All graduate writing workshops are cross-genre and often interdisciplinary, investigating and often undermining a studio versus academic distinction in advanced literary education. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit about these workshops and what this cross-genre work looks like in practice.
Totally. So, it is cross-genre. The workshops are everyone together. So there's no separation between those who are more interested in fiction or poetry, etc. In practice, that looks like reading people's work from a range of different genres, because not everyone is thoroughly genre ambiguous, or I think sometimes where that genre ambiguity shows up, and certainly in my case, is like exploring like, well, what happens if I write this as poetry? Or like, what happens if I write this as fiction? So it doesn't mean that all pieces being workshopped are themselves cross-genre, so to speak, but that influence of people thinking about what different genres can do, I think shows up kind of constantly. And the workshops, I don't know if there's a rhyme or reason to exactly the focus of different workshops. I think it's just kind of up to the faculty who is teaching any given workshop, where, like, for example, my advisor, Anna Joy Springer, did a workshop that was like graphic texts. So everyone was having to do like graphic text in the workshop, which may or may not have been everyone's jam. But I think you learn a lot about like, well, because you could say it's seen as really image rich. And so what's the pacing of prose, like a piece of text prose, like what does graphic text have to teach you about pacing and sort of like image and sort of language? So yeah, I learned a lot from the different workshops. Now that I'm out of the MFA, and I felt this too, like when I completed my last required workshop and was just like, yes, now I actually can do the writing, like, because like that's the thing about the MFA, that the most formal and sort of rigid part of it is that you're just kind of constantly having to show work. Yeah. Like it's not just the producing work, but it's the showing part. Uh-huh. And I feel like, and especially with like some aspects of this project that we've been talking about that I'm working on, like it can be really hard to show writing and process, not because of the content per se, but because of not knowing like what the fuck you're doing, sort of. Yeah. And I think that like maybe that is heightened in a program where people are sort of like often still finding their style. Not everyone. Like I think some people are like pretty set in their style. But yeah, I mean, it was just beyond that. I mean, just like the other part of workshop is just getting to read people's work and getting to kind of being forced to read pretty widely in terms of also people's aesthetics and tastes. And so I think that was just a very enriching experience. The program is can be a little bit academic in terms of there are definitely some required courses that are a little bit more theory heavy. And I felt like that was helpful. There were aspects of that were helpful, and aspects of that I think, as with maybe any grad program, it's just you do so much reading and not all of it is relevant.
So speaking of the academic side of the program also encourages interdisciplinary research, according to the website. And as part of your thesis, you worked with a historian of neuroscience to design and implement an expressive writing intervention with adolescent and young adult cancer patients. So I have to hear about this experience. What was that like?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So just to clarify, I had on my thesis committee and was very privileged to work with a historian of neuroscience, Kathy Gear, who's in the history department at UCSD. And so she, research that I did with her was hugely impactful on this project, not just in terms of sort of thinking about illness and in different ways of that it has been conceptualized historically, in mental illness in particular. But I think also it was just the sort of ethical stakes of some of those questions were really brought out in my conversations with Professor Gear. So that was something that I really felt lucky to do. And I think I was the program in particular enabled me to do that kind of research where, a lot of people have on their committees, because you're actually required to have somebody from outside the literature department. And often people fulfill that with somebody in the visual arts department or something that's more kind of explicitly related to the arts. But for me, especially just because I've sort of straddled these boundaries between healthcare and writing, but then also creative writing, and then sort of critical writing and thinking about illness in particular. That was sort of where my interdisciplinary focus was nurtured and sort of enabled. And enabled also by being in a university that is so robust with different kinds of scholars. Yeah, so that was my research with the historian of neuroscience, and then kind of in that same vein of just being in a kind of behemoth of an institution with all of these different academic departments, and then also healthcare, was that in my first year, I think it was, I was contacted by a doctor who's the director of an oncology department at Rady Children's Hospital. And he was independently really interested in narrative medicine. And this was my first lesson about writing bios, right? And hearing you read my bio, I'm just oh, it's so padded with all of these stupid accomplishments. That's that's actually not the point of a bio. It's to ideally help people who are interested in your work find you, not just to impress people. And so that exercise, when I enrolled in the program, they're send us your bio. It was also describe your research interests. And so I described my research interests or the things that I was interested in. And that was what allowed that connection to be made. So yeah, that was a lesson to me about self-representation, not just being about kind of posturing. That connection blossomed into a project that I'm currently still involved in, where with this interdisciplinary team that includes people from psychology and medicine and philosophy, actually, a medical ethicist. Yeah, we've designed, and I kind of came up with the structure for the writing side of things, intervention for adolescent and young adult cancer patients, for them to get to do writing about their experiences with illness. Yeah, so that was definitely also something that being in that institution enabled.
Well, as I mentioned before, the program's fully funded, and the majority of that funding seems to come in the form of a teaching assistantship. According to the website, UC San Diego encourages a holistic approach to teaching. So what classes were you teaching, and in what ways were you able to utilize your various interests in the classroom?
I taught my whole time at in the program, and I did the 3 years. So it was my first year I TA'd for the way that UC San Diego is broken up, like it's a little different in terms of composition because that actually isn't housed inside the literature department. There's 7 what they call residential colleges. Each of those colleges has its own composition sequence. And so graduate students apply to TA to those colleges directly. And so I TA'd for the culture, art, technology composition sequence inside of 6th College. So, nice name. And that was my first year. And then I TA'd the creative writing sequence in the literature department, and then was back at 6th again for my last year, and also taught. I was able to teach as an associate in last summer, and that was a course that was it was a composition class, but it was like my dream class about intersections of storytelling and culture and medicine. But yeah, so I think it's like a little bit of a misnomer that UC San Diego encourages holistic teaching, because it's like it's an R1 university that's like structured very hierarchically, where it's like that the professor like lectures, and then the TAs interface with the students, and it's like a giant course where it's like my first time in a lecture hall with like 200 students, my first TA experience, just like, what is this, But I will say that I learned so much about myself as a teacher. Like I learned just as much about myself as a teacher and my strengths and some of my weaknesses, and also just about my capabilities from teaching composition, like as I did TAing and teaching and creative writing. I really love teaching. That was like a huge part of my experience in the program, for better and for worse, because it definitely is like a ton of energy to be an educator. And just like a lot of that is like organizational. And not all of that is like fulfilling work for sure. But yeah, it's very much a part of the program experience there.
Yeah, you mentioned to me before the interview the pains and joys involved in making the transition from your life before the MFA into this giant R1 university. So I'm curious to hear a bit more about that, like what it was like being in that bureaucratic world.
For sure. Well, I think just like the biggest shift is suddenly my schedule was so much more aerated, where it's like, I didn't have control over which sections I was assigned to as a teaching assistant. But the volume of hours in the week, which were sort of at somebody else's whims in a way, was like, it suddenly compressed down, to like between 2 to 4, and then classes, but that was 2 days a week. And so I had a lot of responsibility and a lot of work to do. Like it wasn't easy, but the fact that my week to week schedule had all of these pockets that I could find to do writing, like I think that was like one of the biggest shifts, just in terms of shifting from my previous lifestyle into being a graduate student, and finding kind of the space to do more writing. I felt a little bit like this kind of like frog with a suitcase kind of like bolted out on the like superhighway or something, just to like be in San Diego, like moving there from a relatively small town, and then to be in the university, which is huge, and there's a lot of students there. And so I felt that was both exhilarating. There are so many resources and so much going on, and then also, because my previous experience with higher education had been so intimate, like going to Evergreen and getting to work so closely with faculty, it was definitely, it was not the same thing. I did get to work closely with some faculty in some situations, but in general, it was just much more of sort of, swimming in the sea a little bit of the institution.
coming into this new environment with all these new responsibilities and having to juggle all of those responsibilities, did you feel like the faculty in the program was supportive of you in your time there and helping you make that transition?
The composition sequence that I was TAing for did provide, and like I feel like did really support the process into becoming a teaching assistant. And I was very fortunate to be paired up with Professor Phoebe Bronstein, who teaches at CAT. She's not a creative writer, but was a teaching mentor to me in that transition. And so I think that my experience, between teaching composition and then TAing for literature was that I was more supported in teaching, not in the literature department, which has so much to do with just the structure of the department and how overworked people are. So it's not just a faculty choice or something, but kind of the way that the program is, or the department is structured. I felt very supported in that transition. And I remember with my cohort, our first orientation with Professor Springer, Anna Joy Springer, who was at the time the director of the program, where she was just very explicit. It was almost like giving us these little codes about existing in like a professional environment and like trying to make those much more legible and sort of not implicit, but stating them explicitly, where it's like little things like, introduce yourself with your full name when you're in like a kind of like a interdepartment function or whatever. And then also like be very careful about how you communicate because yes, we are your teachers, but also we are people who are potentially going to be your references if you want an academic job, and sort of gave these examples. So it was just felt like a little bit like reading instructions about what the situation was that we were in, which was like both an educational opportunity and potentially like a professionalization opportunity. And so I did really appreciate that kind of guidance. Yeah, but I think like a lot of those, the transitional work, I think is something that I felt supported in with my cohort. People that I was getting to know and later became friends with.
I think your experience is a pretty common one because some of these programs everyone teaches. Some of them, there are some students who teach, some who have fellowships, and then other programs maybe are partially funded where you have some students teaching and other students who aren't funded at all. And what I've heard from some students is that the ones who are teaching sometimes feel like they have more support and they have an easier time building community because there's a group of them that are doing the same thing and there are structures in place to help them.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I know I should ask you questions, but I'm curious. Yeah. Have you been teaching in the program or what?
Yeah, I teach in my program and our program is partially funded. So some students teach, some students have fellowships, and then some students aren't funded at all. Mm-hmm. So that's been an experience I've heard from students in my program. The ones that are teaching like I am, it's much easier to build kind of a community right off the bat because before the first semester even starts, you're in a room with these people and you're like preparing to teach that semester. So you're getting to know the people. You're going to these like bi-weekly meetings, things like that. So there's like a structure in place for a community and for support in a way that's not there if, let's say, you're funded on a fellowship and you don't have to work for that stipend or you're not funded at all.
Absolutely. I mean, and some of the people in the MFA program that I'm closest with were also people that I was TAing with in the composition sequence, right? So even though we weren't in the literature department together, it was like that was an opportunity for us to kind of bond together. And yeah, I mean, it's like the drawbacks and the benefits of teaching where like there is less time for your work. But I've also found, I don't know about you, but like I just feel like my own thought process is always catalyzed by talking to other people, even sometimes about things that have like nothing to do on the surface with my particular puzzle at any given time. And so I do find that there was kind of this like richness in that, and that like that catalyzed in a way also that like I coming to identify as somebody who was in a position of having something to offer. Because like when I started the program, I was 28 And as I mentioned, had all these like weird things about my 20s and sort of sitting in a room with a bunch of 18-year-olds and being like, oh my God, I'm a decade older, like I'm actually old, and it's like, that was like a little bit shocking, but also it was an opportunity to come to see myself differently as somebody who could be a mentor. And I feel like that was actually a really important part of my experience in the program.
Well, UC San Diego, it's a fairly small program. They only accept 4 to 8 new students each year. So I was curious to hear you talk a bit about the pros and cons of a program that's that size, and what kind of sense of community there was amongst the students in the program.
Yeah, I am really so grateful that I've gotten to know and be friends with some people in the program. And so I would say as a whole, like there is really a lot of sense of solidarity and camaraderie in the cohorts, and not just like in the same year of entry, but sort of like across all years in the program. That was my experience. And I don't know that it's actually like this in other programs, but there's sort of like this feeling of, because people were working on such different kinds of work, there was never really competitiveness of like, I'm going to like up realist fiction you or something like, yeah. And so a lot of like willingness to approach each other's works kind of on its own terms, and to kind of like help nurture that work. I think I like the smaller size of the program. Like I never really found myself wanting for more colleagues. I think that like people did have each other's best interests in mind, and that like that small size kind of like enabled it was not always entirely cohesive, but it did enable like at least a sense of kind of like we are one thing together, and despite all of our differences.
Well, you graduated from the program last fall, and when recent graduates come on the show, I always like to ask about their post-MFA life. I know you've been doing some writing coaching since you graduated, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how you got into that and what that experience has been like.
I felt like towards the end of my program, like I did not want to continue working in academia, at least for this time period, in part like just because of feeling like the conditions inside of institutions are so like precarious and competitive, and that just like there might be other ways of doing things that I would like to try out, but also just because like I feel like especially with doing unconventional work, there is this dual challenge, which is both related to craft, like how do I do this work, and sort of like those I felt so enabled by learning, even like as I mentioned, sort of genre specific techniques that I could sort of bring to bear in sort of weirder work. And I didn't know where to find those things before I went into the MFA program. But also like while I was in the program, I was just very aware of how academia is not like always 100% the best setting to really like go in depth with, especially a work where there's like a lot of like kind of personal charge to it, or it's easy to feel discouraged in that kind of work. And it's very like personal and emotional often. And so I think my desire and my choice to pursue doing like writing coaching and teaching outside of academia was a desire to, at least for the time being, kind of see what it's like to pull those things together. And I had worked as a writing tutor as a college student at Evergreen, and just loved getting to go that in depth with an individual writer and sort of like puzzling out. Like it's like I get so much energy from that, and it's so specific, and it's so much attention that in academia, and even in my experience at UC San Diego, as positive as it was, people are so busy. There's just like not really that space to offer that kind of like attention and nurturing support often. And so, yeah, that's been my choice with, really, it's, I started a business. And so that's been a weird thing. But in terms of the actual work, I love it. It's like exactly what I want to be doing right now. And I'm like, I kind of like I'm trying to pull like the key lessons from my program and like in my sort of trials and tribulations, like navigating genre ambiguous work, and kind of try to package it up and make it accessible, like to, you know, if I was looking for a class, you know, like 4 years ago, this is like the class that I would want to have found. And so, I'm teaching that in April, starting in April of this year, and then again in October of 2022. So, and I feel like I learn a lot from, and I'm sure you feel this way, but it's like it just keeps you sharp to teach something. And so to find a balance between being in that position where I'm still teaching things, but also having a little bit more flexibility in my day-to-day life.
Well, that's great. And listeners can find more information about your writing coaching and the class that you're offering at silohradovsky.net. We'll put that on mfawriters.com. Before we go, I want to give you the last word. What's one thing that you think the UC San Diego program does really well, and what's one way you think they could improve?
I feel like there was never a moment in the program where I felt doubted in my capabilities to kind of pull together the work that I was doing. And so I think one thing they do really well, at least in my experience, is that kind of like not just permissiveness, but also like a really deep-seated like trust of the students' experimentations and aptitudes, and just like a kind of like deep respect for the interests that individual students have. And sort of similarly, I feel like the faculty just like really bring it with like all of their various like interests and different kinds of writing that they're interested in doing. So in teaching and also in their individual or work with individual students. I think in terms of the improvements, this is like a university-wide, but a cost of living adjustment for teaching assistants, and in particular, like summer funding. And then within the program, I think that there's just so much bureaucracy, as mentioned, and finding ways to make that easier for students to navigate. And then also just like, if possible, like removing as much red tape inside of the MFA program as possible, because there's a lot of labor that goes into that.
Well, Siloh, it's been so nice to listen to you talk about your experience, and I'm so glad you stopped by. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jared. Best of luck to you with your thesis as well.
Oh, yeah.
This was wonderful.
Turning it in soon. Thank you.
Thank you.